Okay, well, welcome everyone to this next seminar in the Community of Practice Public and Participant series. I'm delighted to introduce today Sagar, who is an assistant professor at Warwick Medical School, working in global mental health. He is also the Warwick Centre for Global Health's Data Science and Digital Theme Lead. His PhD was in brain imaging and cognitive neuroscience, and he's previously worked at the Maudsley Biomedical Research Centre as their patient and public involvement theme coordinator, and was based at the IOPPN there. And also private industry as a data scientist, and has an interest in applying PPI methods, techniques to data science work. So Saga, I'm going to hand over to you for you to introduce your topic and spend, I suppose, 35 to 40 minutes talking, and then we'll have time at the end for people to ask questions. So over to you.
Thank you so much, Rachel, and thanks, Prof. Laura, for the invitation as well. I'm gonna start to share my screen and get on with it because I think I might run out of time. Can you all see my slides in this view?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Perfect. Thanks. Okay, perfect. So yeah, but yeah, my background, I guess, is in neuroscience. I did my PhD at Imperial actually. And I'll talk a little bit more about that because my kind of experience in that stems from the work I did as a data scientist in industry and then as the PPI theme coordinator at the Maudsley BRC, and kind of combining all that to then look at how do service users, how do carers and family members help support our kind of data science and our machine learning building modeling. So I've got these slides about what is service user involvement, what's important, how to involve. I think probably the most interesting thing for this talk or for this community is how to involve. I'm assuming everyone will know kind of what is service user involvement. So I'll probably skip over this or just maybe very briefly go over them, just so we're all on the same page. But in essence, you know, you might have heard all of these kind of terms like user-led research and PPI and PPE and participatory research and even recruitment. But you know, when we're talking about involvement, it's not kind of recruitment for participants are going to kind of the Royal Society Summer Fair to, you know, to display and exhibit your work. It's actually like doing research with or with members of the public or with patients, you know, the classic involve definition. I'll skip over these. I think probably most people here will be familiar with kind of PPI practices and stuff. And in the interest of time, we probably want to focus on the actual work and then kind of how I've involved in my experience. So what I will probably just show is this, so we're on the same page, is that, you know, if you have increasing levels of PPI from the bottom of this kind of upside down pyramid to the top, you know, where you have partnership is where service users, family members, the public initiate the research and lead the project with us, you know, so that might maybe involve, you know, employment in the team, as researchers, co-researchers, co-Is in your grant application, that kind of stuff. And that is kind of where I wanted to go with the work I'll present very shortly. Yeah, and this is what the kind of partnership model looks like, you know, joint grant holders, co-Is on a research project or on future grants projects, identifying research priorities, development of information sheets. That's pretty standard, I guess. Employment of services researchers who then, you know, go about the data collection analysis right up in the same way as, you know, you or I would. And so why is it, very briefly, I guess, why is it important? You probably know this, but there was this Lancet paper in 2009 about research waste, which showed that 85% of biomedical research is wasted, and that's probably because low priority questions are addressed, not just low priority questions, but the wrong questions. And so there was this idea that promising beginnings do not end up in benefits because we're just asking the wrong questions, basically. So as I was kind of in my journey of getting involved in PPI and leading the PPI theme, you know, at the Maudsley BRC, you know, we started doing a lot of work about. I was doing a lot of work on, you know, what does impact mean? What is PPI? Like, how do we assess its impact? And so for example, I wrote some papers on why it's important and its impact. So for example, this one study, I will come on to the modeling bit in a minute, but this is just to preface what we'll talk about. So this was one paper where And we looked at how to make sort of documents clear and relevant, and look at the impact of patient involvement. Where we essentially asked service users we gave them some study documents like consent forms or information sheets, and just basically asked them to review them and ask them, how are these readable, basically, do you understand what's going on in the study? And we looked at kind of quant metrics as well, like this word count, character count, but also like this Flesch-Kincaid grade level. This is like a metric on readability. So we looked at we did a whole bunch of work. We looked at research papers, we looked at apps, and the idea is that there's a recommendation that the consent forms and basically anything patient facing should be written to a grade 8 level, like in the American grade 8 or lower. And then we asked service users to give us some kind of give us some guidelines, and then we compared what service users said to what the HRA say. So this was kind of all this background work that was going on before I started doing any modeling, to just essentially understand, like, how do we get research in a place where, especially biomedical research, psychiatric research, how do we get in a place where service users can actually provide full, informed consent, and so they were saying avoid repetition, gives clarity on inclusion criteria, exclusion criteria. They point out things like the order of text has to make sense. Like if in your information sheet, like, what are we doing first? Why am I being invited to that order must flow. And then we asked them to, like, highlight some phrases in information sheets that didn't make sense. So, for example, you see here, like, some of the terms that are used by researchers on this side, and then we asked them to suggest some alternatives. So we would say, like, acquire. What we actually mean is collect data. Various words basically that the service users highlighted, and then jargon phrases that they highlighted, i.e. don't use this. And all of this was kind of happening in the background alongside while I was thinking about how do I apply all of these kind of principles into data science. And then, because of my neuroscience background, I was working a lot with the neuroscientists at the IOPPN. So Mattia, at the time, he approached me and said, like, you've done all this work on information sheets, like, we have a problem in neuroscience. How do we make, like, imaging, MRI, PET imaging, this kind of stuff, how do we make that more engaging so people understand? And, again, we went and did this work with service users to understand what would make neuroscience studies more engaging. And we worked with the graphic designers who then basically, as a group, us and then the service users and this illustrator, we kind of redesigned information sheets from the first version A to B, basically, and then we asked another set of service users to kind of tell us what they think. Is it more, understandable? And so that was all published. So amongst all of that background, that all work was going on, and alongside that, I was doing some other work, which is what I'll talk about now, which is data science. But it was, as I was doing all this work with service users, it was making me think about the work we do as data scientists, as modelers, as people working with quant data and machine learning algorithms. And it's like, that's really interesting because, like, the neuroscience folks have obviously identified that, look, we think our service users don't understand what exactly happens in an MRI scanner, what is happening in the PET scanner, and this kind of stuff. Do we, as data scientists, have we gone through that kind of same journey, or do we also have that same issue? We work with big data, we're pulling data from databases. Do people know where that data is coming from, or when they sign up to consent to putting the data in a register, to register a database, do they know what's going to happen with that data? So all these kind of thoughts were going into my mind, going through my mind, and then I started looking at this, the idea of participatory modeling. And so, why is that important in data science? And kind of having conversations, particularly in the BRC then, about this. And it made me think back to my PhD, actually. So I'll just start the kind of my seminar on this topic, which is the data that lives in a database comes from somewhere, most likely a patient or a service user. And this occurred to me quite late on. So during my PhD, I was doing I was recruiting people with a traumatic brain injury and putting them through a scanner, an MRI scanner. And so, for example, I would collect all of these kind of classic people with psychology background. You might recognize this, like the seminar matrix reasoning, the verbal fluency test, all of these kind of traditional neuropsych tests. and they'd do like this 2-hour battery with me. And then remember, these are patients after traumatic brain injury, recruited from an NHS clinic, a neurology clinic. Now I've invited them to the Hammersmith Hospital, sat with them, doing a 2-hour a battery of these tests, and then putting through them making them play some cognitive games in an MRI scanner, doing some FRI imaging, and analyzing the data, and doing all that kind of stuff. But the most interesting part that I realized afterwards was actually during this whole process, although this, the images and the analysis are really interesting, but during the neuropsych, the conversation, the 2-hour spend with them doing the neuropsych and just consenting, getting to know them, was quite interesting, because they'd give me a lot more information about their life and their condition and what's happened to them and how their life's turned upside down since, for example, they've been in this accident. And all of that well, none of that information actually went into any of the analyses. It was just, we were just talking basically. And in that 2-hour session, I got all this rich information from them, which wasn't recorded, and all I was collecting was this kind of stuff, the neuropsych. And that made me think, well, actually, I wish at the time I knew about this, the idea of patient involvement and how that information can then feed into my data, because it would really help me contextualize some of the stuff. And so this was at the time when I was in the BRC, and I was kind of going through this journey, that I was putting all of these different thoughts together. My experiences from my PhD, my experiences of working in private industry, my experience of working in the neuroscience team. And I was like, okay, how do we, kind of think about data science and algorithms in a way that, we do in other parts. So I started looking at what are the problems with machine learning. Okay, well, there's these issues of bias, garbage in, garbage out. Okay, well, let's try solving that. Let's, that might be one thing to work with service users about. So these are all the kind of thoughts I was having. I was putting these examples together to talk to our PPI group about. I was like, okay, I mean, some of these are more recent, but for example, we talk about kind of how computer vision is biased. How do we minimize that or get rid of it? I remember having a conversation with them about Amazon's recruitment services. When they trained, they would shortlist candidates using an AI they trained, but the AI was trained on the existing staff, and the existing staff just happened to be, the early cohort staff just happened to be clever, middle class white young men from Harvard, that would then show bias against, equally, well capable women or other people basically. And so we were having these conversations about bias in AI with PPI groups, and then through those conversations, in the topic of kind of setting the scenario or developing a research program that's important to service users, one thing we started talking about was social media and like stigma and the kind of problems that we see on social media. And this came through the conversation I was having with a young person's mental health advisory group. These are a group of young people, I guess 18 to 24. I used to facilitate this PPI group for about 5 years. So I knew them quite well, and we would often in these meetings we'd have sometimes just generally talk. So we started talking about AI and bias and then through other conversations about how algorithms on social media, they just show you what you're used to seeing, and then through those conversations we started talking about, oh, I wish we could change that, and then people started talking about them seeing horrible stuff about mental health problems, when they're searching for things that like support groups, they'll often see stigmatizing tweets or trivializing tweets. And then that led to some of the work I then subsequently did. So this was the first piece of work, which was using Twitter to investigate mental health stigma. And at this stage, the idea just kind of came from service users and the young people. We didn't really involve them. This was a kind of a small study that we had 2 medics do from King's, Patrick and Daniel. And so it was their project. And so, they had, we pitched the idea through service users, and then they went ahead and did it. But then alongside that, I thought, okay, well, in order for me to then progress this, okay, we need to define some principles. And at the same time, I came across this data for good exchange, CPEDS principles, and this was published about how to make data sharing ethical and how to make data science, ethical and develop good practice in it. And so they published these principles, like, for example, as data teams, we aim to use data to improve life for our users, customers, organizations, create reproducible, extensive work. And you don't need to read the whole list, but anyway, there was, I'd say 12 kind of principles. And then you could sign up to it. So I was, I signed up to it and I thought, okay, so now when I do any work, I'm going to apply those principles and go about my work. So all of this then led up to this piece of work that I did with the young persons at mental health advisory group. So this was published 2022 now. It's getting old, but so the idea came from conversations I had with the PPI group about AI and bias, and then the problem of social media, problem of stigma, and then being able to identify that. And I was like, oh, okay, well, I have a background in modeling AI. Can an AI do it? And then we started talking about how would an AI do it. Then I came across those principles, and then I thought, okay, how can we apply those principles to going ahead and doing this work? So I discussed those principles with the PPI group, and then in the paper, I published. I addressed each of those points, or at least some of those points. Okay, we've signed up to these principles, but I've signed up to these 12 goals. This is the piece of work that I'm doing. This is how this is how I've addressed point one in this piece of work. So I can't remember what exactly the point one was in the principle, but I said, okay, we used our data to identify schizophrenia stigma in accordance with concerns that services had about this stigma. So in the paper, I kind of just applied those principles as the first step. And then in the method section, you'll see all the kind of the background to the background about the first step on involving service users in this work. So this is the advisory group. This was the young person advisory group. We'd talk through them. I'd talk with them. And then the other thing we did with the group was, or the other thing I did with the group was to identify features. So what I did was essentially take once we have the project idea about identifying stigma, I went back to back to work, looked up Twitter, pulled some tweets. At the time when it was Twitter, and we had a public API, you could pull tweets, and then took a sample of them to the group and said, okay, guys, can we just have a look at these? Do you find anything stigmatizing in this? Like, is there anything that, in your opinion, characterizes these tweets as things that you don't want to see? Whether they're stigmatizing or trivializing, just can you tell me what you find in these tweets? And then so in the actual machine learning, we had 10 features, but they identified 4. So for example, they looked at the tweet and said, I've noticed whenever there's a number of a numeric character in a tweet. So for example, like the number 4 instead of an A, or an 8 instead of an E, that in the kind of young text talk. They were like, I've noticed that's often something that I tweet that I don't like. And I wasn't asking them to be very scientific about, like, oh, you have to define stigma in this way. I was just having a conversation, like, what about this tweet makes you think that this is stigmatizing or makes you uncomfortable, right? And then said, well, a lot of these tweets, they'll say something that I'm not really happy with, and what's really annoying is that they'll end in like a list of like 15 exclamation marks, a punctuation, and it makes me feel that they're annoyed or they're angry, or they're trying to make an angry point, or this kind of stuff. The number of uppercase words, as if they're shouting. So this was just the PPI group just talking through, looking through data and just kind of talking, and I'd just be making notes, And to me, that was like a form of feature engineering. Okay, can I now use some of the information that they're telling me to then pass out from the data? So then when I went back that following week, when I went back to the office, I wrote some code to say, okay, count the number of numeric characters in these tweets, count the number of punctuation marks, exclamation marks or punctuations in these tweets. And alongside that, I'd asked them also to categorize tweets as, for example, stigmatizing or not, simple binary classification. And I did a simple t-test in the first case. So we had tweets that they thought were non-stigmatizing and tweets that they thought were stigmatizing. And I looked at various features like sentiment, subjectivity, average word length. And of these four, included in this, are four that they found. And two of those four showed, were able to classify tweets, were showing significant difference between stigmatizing and non-stigmatizing tweets. So I thought that's an interesting finding, in the first instance, when I model, if we include these two features, that might show or might give some kind of high predictability or high predictive value to identify stigmatizing tweets. So this was kind of all the background work I was doing, just kind of talking to the advisory group about the idea, about AI and that kind of stuff. And then about social media and their experience with social media, which just came up through conversations, bias in social media, things they don't want to see. How do you identify that? What characterizes things that they think are uncomfortable or stigmatizing? What is stigma? These are all conversations that I had with the PPI group that then was, building up to this kind of work. So I was at the stage where I thought, okay, now let's formalize this now, right? So let me pull some more data. Let me create a training data set. So in the days when it was Twitter and we had a public API and you connected to Twitter, and I extracted loads of tweets, e.g. on various conditions, psychosis, OCD. And this came from the first Twitter paper that the two medics wrote. So I thought, let me just use those hashtags. And then we had, in the first instance, two service user researchers separately rate the tweets for stigma. So, in the group, we would employ people with lived experience of mental health problems. And we said, okay, apply experiences to now say, are these tweets, in your case, stigmatizing or not? And through conversation with them, they were like, actually, it's not that what they said was actually, it's not that they're stigmatizing or not. It's not a binary thing, but it could be stigmatizing. And through that conversation then with them, we developed this rating scale. Okay, well, it's either not or it is, or then it's potentially stigmatizing, It was a kind of iterative process. And then again, I had a conversation with the YPAC, the Young Person Mental Health Advisory Group about this. And they're like, yeah, we agree, because that's what they found when I asked them to just look through tweets, like the punctuation. They couldn't say it's definitely stigmatizing, but it makes me feel stigmatizing. So it could be potentially. So here are some examples, basically, just to kind of make it a bit more concrete. So this was a tweet: psychosis can wax and wane over an hourly, daily, weekly basis, Bendick says. So that was rated as not stigmatizing, right? But by our researchers, service use researchers. And then it says, had to call the police on a schizo in my building's parking garage. This was potentially stigmatizing. And then there's tweets: every time I get up to go to the bathroom, my coworker stares at me and freaks out because she thinks I'm going to a secret meeting she's not invited to. Imagine being that psychotic. This was classified as stigmatizing. And then a Daily Mail headline, which was in the data set, this was classified as stigmatizing. So through this, it's an iterative process, right? It's in like, it wasn't like I set off to have this kind of rating system, 0, 1, and 2. It was through conversation with service users that we can't exactly define stigma, like it's subjective. Some things could be stigmatizing, but we need a larger opinion. So then what we did was everything that was rated as 0, as in not stigmatizing, we took that for face value. Everything that was definitely stigmatizing, i.e. 2, we took that at face value. And where there were discrepancies, i.e. where there was a 1, like it could be stigmatizing, could it not, asked somebody else, basically, like a third decision maker. So here you can see any tweets that were coded as 0, we checked them, and then wherever the discrepancies, not only did I look at discrepancies or tweets that were 1s, but anywhere where there was disagreement between the two initial service user raters. So, and what was the point of this was on the topic of trying to minimize bias in my data set. So the data set is embedded in lived experience. It's embedded in, like, it's grounded, sorry, in lived experience. It's grounded in not my opinion, as somebody who hasn't experienced mental health problems, or at least as somebody who had, this idea was driven by young people. It's what their experience is. Okay, let's explain your experiences and let's turn it into a research project. And I was kind of going about it in that way. So I wanted the data set to be grounded in their experiences, grounded in their opinion. And so we would do a bit of work. I'll take it back to the group. They'd give their opinion on it. And so Yeah, and then again, I did another thing where once we had this final data set, I just took maybe 20% of the tweets and said, okay, this is what we've agreed. Do you agree? You know, and did this with user researchers in our team, but also we looked through this with the YPAC as well. You know, what do you think about this? Do you agree? Yes or no? Essentially, what I wanted was a really high agreement rate, right? You know, I think in the end we reached about 99% or something. But yeah, okay, this sort of 20% of tweets, you know, are definitely what you've classified them as. And then the point of that is, you know, when I open my Python script and I start coding, I know that the target variable, you know, the classification, you know, I'm confident that okay, well, this is definitely a tweet that users find as stigmatizing or not. So that was the point of this whole exercise. And then the usual, you know, I think it was an 80-20 split, training and testing, the usual kind of natural language processing aspects. So, you know, pre-processing, vectorizing, and then on this topic of feature engineering, remember I already had these conversations with the PPI group about you know, why they thought some tweets were stigmatizing, and they said, oh, the numbers or number of punctuation. So I already had that kind of information, which I then reused and basically leveraged to do the analysis here. These are some slides on vectorizing, but I'm going to skip over them in the interest of time, and it's not really a tutorial. So, but happy to talk about this at any stage. So yeah, the whole idea of feature engineering was me asking what other information would be useful. That people had already told me that, you know, like the average word length, number of words, punctuation marks. So I added all of those into the model. And like I said, the YPAC identified that 4 of the 10 features in a previous one data set. So I was confident that I could take some of the information and apply it. So there we are. That was that at that stage. I then, you know, I think, you know, I tested a few models, random forests and clustering algorithms and the sort. And what I wanted to understand was how accurate is our computer at classifying tweets as stigmatizing compared to our human coders. So I ran the models. We had an accuracy score, and interestingly, I then when I went back to the PPI group and I said, okay, this is what we found. You know, I've run some algorithms. This is what we found. What we then had a conversation was about evaluation metrics. You know, I explained what accuracy is, and then I explained false positive, false negatives. And they said actually the thing we're interested in from our perspective is false negatives. You know, where we predicted no, but the tweet is actually stigmatizing. You know, that's so again, the PPI group then suggested to me, you know, rather than just focus on accuracy, you know, the evaluation metrics, the key thing that they're interested in is false negatives. And so when I wrote the paper, actually, false negatives was the initially, you know, when I submit the paper, you know, we only reported false negatives, and then obviously through reviewers and the academic process, we had to then report everything else. But you know, we specifically write that false negatives was our primary evaluation metric through our PPI. These are some other bits of work which did some other validation. So I pulled another set of 500 tweets, and this was all on the topic of reducing bias, you know, and kind of validating models. And so at that stage, okay, what I was thinking about was the, you know, methods of feature extraction, like how can service users help? Okay, certainly they can look through the data, they can help us extract features, understand the data, understand what is there anything within the data that can then become a variable or a column in our model? Can they help with other NLP or machine learning techniques in the same way as they do with feature engineering? Can they help with vectorizing or other, you know? So, you know, this was the kind of start of my journey, thinking, okay, well, this is really cool. You know, I'm getting some information from service users. We're doing some participatory modeling, and I was just thinking more broadly, how else can service users be embedded in the machine learning pipeline? So far at the start, the middle, at the end with the evaluation metrics, you know, what was most appropriate to them wasn't accuracy, it was actually false negatives. And then the other problem we faced was actually companies can do what they want. So through process, when Elon Musk took over Twitter, then the public API went. And this was at the time when we were looking at using music to then characterize mental health problems as well. So, one idea we had with the services was actually, can we pull music data can music be a proxy then to understand people's mental health? And then as I was going to sort of start that project, Spotify changed their API and basically closed down the kind of endpoints, the API endpoints that we would need, which really kind of was a bit of a kick in the teeth. So a lot of the work we do in data science, especially on using big data, public data, open access data, or at least connected to APIs, it can change overnight. So we just need to be careful on that. We're creating lasting knowledge on temporary data essentially. And this is just a thought. It's not. I'm not saying there's a solution, but it just kind of something to consider when embedding or involving service users in your machine learning or in your data science projects. Where is the data coming from, and is it likely to change? Because who knows? Companies can do what they want. And then on the back of that, I got a grant from the AI from AI UK, Alzheimer's Research UK, to do something similar on dementia misconceptions on social media. And so we put, again, I applied a mixed methods approach. So we had lots of focus groups. This is with carers, people who care for if you're a carer for somebody with dementia, you'd be part of a PPI group at the OPPN, and I worked with that PPI group. And again, in the first phase of the study, open conversations about dementia misconceptions. What is a misconception? What characterizes it? What are their experience of social media? And all of that information from this work, there are a couple of papers, went into producing the machine learning model in this paper. And you can see some of the authors here are members of the group. So again, the work was co-authored, which is one thing I didn't do in the schizophrenia work. In the previous paper I showed you. So again, it's like it was a journey for me, kind of, okay, how do I improve on this? How do I again bridge the gap between PPI and data science and research? So these were, again, the activities were quite similar. I took a set of tweets to the dementia group and I said, the carer group, and said, okay, what is positive, what is negative, what is a misconception, and then they kind of looked through the tweets and and they helped categorize it. And there were all sorts of activities, kind of, we had like sticky notes, and they'd write stuff on sticky notes and put them in different groups, and then we'd talk about what does this cluster mean, what does that cluster mean. So you could characterize it as just qualitative research of some kind. And so essentially first exploring what you should be searching, how do we search it? Because in the schizophrenia paper, the keywords came from literature. This time, the first conversations I had with the carer group was actually, what are the kind of terms that you've heard or you've seen people talk about dementia on social media about? So for example, they came up with these terms in red, loony being brain dead, dementia stigma. These are the kind of words that they kind of highlighted, which I then used when I did the when I pulled the data from the Twitter API. And in this case, they identified 18 features, 13 for misconceptions, 5 for neutral tweets. So there was a lot going on. And of those 18, not half of them significantly distinguished between misconceptions and neutral tweets. So again, it kind of made me think, okay, well, if I didn't go through this process of identifying keywords and then looking at the tweets with carers to identify what makes it a misconception, I wouldn't have had these, I wouldn't have had these 18 features, of which 9 were actually quite useful from a modeling perspective. And then for this project, I went one step further, and we developed a campaign with them, which we then did some other piece of work on. But anyway, we don't need to go into that because that's beyond the modeling. And then in my current work in global mental health, I was applying. I want to do a similar project. So we have a project which I'm leading at the moment called the Transform Project. And this is a global mental health project which is set in Bangladesh, in Nigeria, and obviously us in Warwick. But the research is the primary site of research where data collection and recruitment is happening in Ibadan in Nigeria and Dhaka in Bangladesh. And the idea of the study is working with traditional and faith healers to refer patients with serious mental illness to biomedical care. So a lot of people from people in Dhaka and Ibadan, Nigeria, when they have things like psychosis, they would go to a traditional and faith healer for help, cultural practices, what they're used to, what they know. And a lot of these people live in slums, so it was a slum health project. This is an example of where the community that we're working with live. This is our Dhaka-based PI investigator. He's going around talking to the community, and this is an example of the kind of stuff that the traditional faith healers would use. They'd use oils and ointments and various apparatus. And through and so in the project, we're working with healers to then be able to identify things like psychosis and send them on to biomedical care. And through the community work that we were doing there, actually what we realized is there's a lot of young people on social media, right? And I thought, okay, we could apply a similar project like I've done in the UK, but to a cohort in Nigeria and Bangladesh. So obviously the first thing I did was look at how is mental illness spoken about in these contexts from these countries. So, on Twitter, filtered it to a country and did a search. And this was an example of something that came up, which I found quite interesting. So this went viral, I guess, in 2022. It's a guy who's from Nigeria, who's obviously, he went to Ukraine or wherever he went to get a job, and he experienced psychosis, and it was a long thread, and he was he was just talking about what happened, and what I was interested in is obviously the comments and how people are responding to this, right? And what I found was that there are examples of biomedical support. People would say there's a clear case of psychosis, you need professional help, you need to go see a psychiatrist, go see a doctor, get a diagnosis. And there'd be people on the other side who would say, oh, this is, you need God. Call this pastor, call this imam, recite this, because only God can save you. And I didn't, up until then, I didn't view any of the data I was dealing with through this cultural lens. It was always, it was always from, I guess, biomedical lens or lens I was, familiar with from a UK perspective. And that opened up a whole kind of new area for me on which to focus on. So, which I haven't quite solved yet, actually, and I'm still working through this. So any kind of thoughts or conversation that would be useful. But it also then gave me some other food for thought. I'm going to skip over this because it's not really important. Okay, well, you're off. Thank you for listening. But I think the point I wanted to make about this was I was then looking at how to collect this data, because the tweets and stuff, at this stage now, the Elon Musk had taken over Twitter, and there was no Twitter, so I couldn't pull data easily. So I was looking at different ways of collecting data and collecting social media data. And that is where I am at now, kind of trying to apply work I'd done in the UK to different contexts and different kind of cultural settings. And how do we apply machine learning? How do we involve service users from these other countries who have other cultural beliefs, and remain respectful, and apply those into our machine learning kind of models and our data science work. And that's where I am right now, basically. So I don't know. I'll end there. Let me just take you to the last slide, because I'm also conscious of time. There we are.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. So just going to open it up now to any questions, and please feel free to pop your hands up or pop your questions into the chat. Let me just see if anything's come through. I can't see anything at the moment. Can I start by asking a question about, I suppose, with the changes with Elon Musk, for example, taking over Twitter X, have you started looking at things like Blue Sky, LinkedIn, other social media platforms?
I started looking at, I tried to look at TikTok.
Okay.
Because apparently lots of people in Dhaka use TikTok.
Yeah.
TikTok and WhatsApp, but we can't access WhatsApp. So, and that was just through, again, community, talking to the community as part of this project, as part of our large NHR project. So,
Ellie, would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, thank you so much for the talk. I was wondering, so when you were working with the young people mental health group, how often were you kind of meeting with them? Because it sounds like they were involved obviously a lot in this development.
Mhm.
So how often did you have to meet with them to keep them that involved?
Yeah, it's so the group as a group we'd meet every 6 weeks, and every it wouldn't just be me as in my project. It would like for example in these meetings we'd meet every 6 weeks and there's 3 slots, and so uh, whenever there's a slot not taken, I would take it to discuss this work. So maybe I'm not talking to them every 6 weeks. It might be I might not get a chance, in the second week, but on the third week I might have a slot. Or if there's an important update during lunch, I would just talk to them. So it was a kind of regular kind of conversation that it would just kind of evolve, and then they would give me some advice and I'd go back and work on it. And then when I see them again, I'd probably just give an update, but there was nothing more. And then I'd do a bit more work, and then they'd tell me something that needed something more formal work. So it was a kind of iterative process over ages, maybe over like I don't know, 9 months or a year or something. It was just through conversation. I didn't set out from the start to I didn't have a plan. Okay, this is what the PPI group can help with. I just was talking to them, and through talking to them, I developed this kind of method,
Okay.
of embedding them across the machine learning pipeline, which now I'm using going forward.
Cool. Awesome. Can I ask one quick follow-up? So obviously how much of the actual machine learning stuff did you explain to them? Or how much did you feel did they want to or need to know for
Oh,
this
it's
process?
interesting question. Some of the young people were interested, some weren't. And so I didn't explain so those slides I skipped over them, but you saw I had some slides on vectorization. Like those slides I showed to them. I explained to them, okay, well, this is what when you vectorize text, this is what happens. You reduce it to its lowest canonical form and and then each tweet becomes a row, and then the data set expands and like that. And they appreciated that level of explanation. Nothing technical. Like I didn't say, okay, this is k-nearest neighbors and you have Euclidean distance and this is them, like they didn't, not that kind of stuff. It was just why am I doing this? Why am I asking them these questions about feature engineering? Because then I could explain, I asked you about characterizing these tweets and you told me about punctuation, and I've extracted a number of punctuation because it's going to become a column in the model, just to that kind of level.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you. Susie, would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, thank you for that presentation. That was really nice, and it was great to see on some of your outputs that you've had the public members as co-authors, which is great. I think right at the beginning of your talk you mentioned about having sort of your public partners as co-applicants on grants, and I personally find that really hard to do because at that time point you don't have money. So I just wondered how you've approached that. How have you been able to incorporate public members as co-applicants?
Yeah, good question. Because I think I was lucky in the BRC. The Maudsley BRC. You get these big infrastructure grants where things are already made and set up, and so the infrastructure exists for us to kind of go in and work with the PPI group. I didn't have to pay the PPI group; they were being paid from the BRC, and so therefore, guys, who's interested in this project on dementia? Oh, me. Okay, there you are. What will you do? X, Y, and Z. I just put that down in the grant as a justification of resources. And so I didn't have to do anything beyond what the infrastructure allowed me to do. So I guess I was lucky in that way. We're lucky we have things like the ARC and the BRC and these infrastructures. So I just leveraged those really.
No, that's great. No, big thanks to the BRC. And sorry, this might be a silly question, but I was just thinking it's really great what you've done. I'm just thinking, I don't know, I sometimes post things online and never even crosses my mind that my post could be used in a piece of research by someone. Is there any, I don't know if there's been I don't know if there's any ethical things or anything, any data protection things you've had along the way.
Loads.
Because I've never thought about it.
You know what? This is a very interesting point. So when I was applying for ethics, this was when I was at King's and actually at Warwick as well. Back and forth with ethics and do we need ethics? It's open source data, it's public data. And I actually sent them the terms and conditions to, at the time, Twitter. so when you sign up to Twitter as a user, you agree to the terms and conditions, which no one ever reads. So I sent them a screenshot of it and a link, and I think it was like clause 2 something, 2 point something something. It says, I agree to my data being used for research purposes via the Twitter API. So I said, look, if Susie's going to tweet, she's already agreeing to this. She's already accepted the terms of Twitter. So, and Twitter have made this API all public for people like me in academia, and the ethics committee said fine. And then I showed them that, look, I've signed up to these CPEDs, I'm going to use it responsibly. And I explained to the ethics committee how I will ensure, for example, that you, Susie, are not identified. So I said, when I publish, I'm not going to put your handle, I'm just going to put the tweet and that kind of stuff. So,
Brilliant.
and they were happy with that.
Yeah, that's just great to know that that's in the terms of Twitter and whatnot. Thank you. Or X.
That's fascinating, and I often say about people, just sign up to these terms and conditions, and none of us read them, and then okay. Are there any other questions? Kimon, would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, thank you for this talk. It was really interesting. You mentioned that you're using TikTok as an alternative platform. How do you manage to keep people engaged on TikTok? I'm asking because recently I find interesting that there are people basically using overstimulation videos. It's like the videos that plays in the background, like a game that you follow, and they tell a story. And they're doing recently something similar with research. So basically they're telling the research and you have the video in the background so people stay engaged and listen. Have you ever tried that?
So remember, I'm not using TikTok data per se. I'm using conversations from TikTok.
Okay.
So not exactly how the user interacts with it. This is kind of, so is it like metadata? Like it's not like how long is the person staying on data. I'm just saying, like, what are the comments on Twitter? So like there's and also there's this I've just posted it. It's an unofficial API for TikTok. It's not very good, to be honest. So it's not. I'm not sure how well it will be published. Because it's not very good data, but I'm trying to use TikTok, should I say? So in similar, I'm just pulling kind of data, like imagine web scraping. Like somebody might be talking about depression, and I'm just web scraping the tweets, as opposed to what is the engagement on that video. But perhaps I'm sure that's a good point. It's a different way of looking at engagement on content. Yeah.
Are there any other last questions? We've got time for one more question. No? Okay, well, if not,
Sorry, can I?
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. I could see your physical hand before I saw your.
Sorry, yeah. Final question. So you've made these like classifiers. How do people want to use them? Do your groups have interested in like using them, being able to like pick up tweets and feed them to this and be like, yeah, that is stigmatizing? Or is it like something you want to be like embedded into a platform that like flags stigmatizing or not?
Both, actually. So the idea was that we make a pop-up on your web browser that runs this algorithm that you can then switch on when you're scrolling, for example, X, and that will then filter things in and out. That requires a whole different set of skills beyond the project and beyond me as a data scientist, for example. But that was the initial idea, was that it'll be kind of a pop-up, you just attach to your Google Chrome when you're on X. You don't want to see, you want to see some stuff, you don't want to see some other stuff, switch it on, bang. Yeah. So if you're a computer scientist or engineer, then let's do it.
That sounds great. You can imagine that being used, I don't know, on beyond X, but other social media platforms to, protections to, if there's age limits and things like that, you can use it. That sounds great. But yeah, no idea how to do that, sorry.
No, same.
Okay, well, that brings us to time. So thank you so much. That was fascinating and generated lots of questions. So yeah, thank you very much for your time. And
thank you all. Nice to meet you all as well. Bye.
Bye.